As Moses instructed the Israelites to tell the children their history so that the children would understand the stipulations, decrees, and laws that God had commanded His people to obey, so in future, when your children ask you what caused the split in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, tell them these things that vividly capture the facts of the case. In spite of the happenings, there is one body, one Spirit, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 20 and Ephesians chapter 4 verse 4 to 6. The Global Evangelical Church is an offshoot of the Bremen missionary work in the Gold Coast and Togoland. In 1847, German missionaries sailed all the way and arrived in the Gold Coast on the 5th of May. The missionaries were Lorenz Wolf, 26, Karl Flatto, 25, Louis Boltzmann, 28, and 32-year-old James Graff. The missionaries were sent to Africa to do the following: establish schools and start churches, study the customs and cultures of the people, as well as master the local languages.
When they arrived, they went to the Wesleyan missionaries, that is Methodist Church now. But the Wesleyan missionaries advised the new arrivals that they would prefer that they come to Osu and meet with the Basel missionaries. So they came down to Accra and met with Basel missionaries at Osu. And the Basel missionaries also advised that it would be better for the new missionaries to go to Everland, where no one had gone. This was pleasant news to Graff and Wolf.
Wolf and Graff followed the advice of the Basel missionaries, and Wolf set off for Everland. Wolf met a young prince from Peki, Nyangamagu, who was excited to send the missionaries to meet his father, the king of the Pekis, Togbi Kwajode Tutu V. The two decided that only Wolf should go to Peki while Graff stayed at the Christiansborg Castle at Osu.
They were joyfully received by the paramount chief, Nyankamagu's father, who was there too. And Wolf settled down with the people and started work. The chief of Peki Wudome had a very big sore, and Wolf was dressing it for him till the sore was healed. And he was also about to be baptized, as he had received the message of Christ preached to him by Wolf. But all of a sudden, he died. And it was believed that he was killed. And the natives also said it is because he was associating with the white people, the missionaries, and with the message. That's why the gods came to kill him. This dispirited Wolf so much that after his 5 years' work, he hadn't got any convert. And his health was going down, and he decided to go home.
Wolf returned to Germany to seek medical treatment but died upon arrival at the port of Hamburg in 1851. In 1852, William Double, Johannes Menge, and Friedrich Kühnus returned to continue the work left by Wolf in Peki. That same year, the missionaries were compelled to abandon the work at Peki due to the Peki-Akwamu War of 1852. They went to Keta, where they finally succeeded at baptizing 7 converts after 7 years of missionary work.
The missionaries worked hard to get converts. And after 2 years, they had 7 people. But these 7 were not the natives, but they were people from other parts of Gold Coast who were living in Keta. There were only 2 Evis among the converts, but there were 7 in all. And they were baptized. And it made the history in that the missionaries had come to the Gold Coast and had worked for 7 years before getting 7 converts. And by then, 7 missionaries also had died.
The missionaries continued their work at Adakluwaya, Anyako, Ho, Amejope, Akpafu, and Bwem, until their work of converting people from idol worship spread all over Everland. Several of them also yielded to the rule that governed missionary work in Africa, that is, a call of willingness to suffer and rejoice in death.
The Bremen missionaries were compelled to leave Everland as a result of the First World War that took place between 1914 and 1918. Germany was defeated by the Allied forces made up of the British and the French. Having defeated Germany, they took over German territories. And therefore, the German missionaries were considered as security threat, and they were forced to leave the territory.
The missionaries also trained some native pastors, notably Rudolf Mallet, ordained in 1882 as the first local pastor. Samuel Newell and Adolf Lawo were ordained in 1901. Andreas Aku and David Bensa were ordained in 1910. Robert Kwame and Theodore Sedude were ordained in 1911, and Elias Awoma ordained in 1912. It is generally believed that the Ewe language is one of the most developed languages and most widely spoken in Africa.
It has several dialects. Even the south alone, we have the Anglo dialect, we have the Mafi, we have the Agave. Then we go to Epadoma, we have different dialects. Ewe is spoken in Benin, in the Republic of Togo, and these are all different dialects of the Ewe language. Fortunately for us, the missionaries came with some linguists as part of their mandate to study the language and the culture of the people they were coming to. The missionaries endeavored to reduce the Ewe language, which was a spoken language, to writing. And they developed an Ewe orthograph.
Early attempts at translating the Bible into Ewe started in 1858 by a missionary called Reverend Bernhard Skledel. Other early translators were Reverend John Mears, Jacob Spieth, and Gottlob Dobbel. They completed translating the entire Bible by 1911.
By January 1916, the first printed copies of the Bible were received at Keta, and it was a celebration.
Unlike other languages, Ewe has a standard orthography used by all the Ewe dialects. It is worth noting that the translation of the Bible into Ewe was not done by the missionaries only. 5 native teachers assisted the missionaries in translating the Bible. They were Joseph Kudese, Andreas Aku, Samuel Quist, Ludwig Ajaklo, and Joseph Tosu. The last batch of missionaries left the Gold Coast in January 1914 when the First World War broke out in Europe. But Reverend Ernst Bergi was allowed to remain because he was a Swiss resident in Lomé.
He worked there until September 1921, when he had to leave because of ill health.
Before the departure of Reverend Bergi, Reverend Andreas Aku, a native of Adaklu, was elected the first moderator of the church. It was under his leadership that the first synod was held at Palime from the 19th to the 22nd of May 1922. This marked the beginning of a pure African leadership of the church.
Andreas Aku was elected as the moderator of the church, both British or the Anglophone and the Francophone.
The Second Synod in September 1923 redemarcated the church into English and French-speaking zones.
Consequently, two sets of leaders were elected for each of the zones. For the English zone or the Anglophone zone, Reverend David Bensa was elected moderator, and Reverend Robert Kwame as synod clerk. And for the Francophone zone, Reverend Andreas Aku was elected moderator with Reverend Robert Baita as the synod clerk.
The liturgy of the church was revised, and in 1931, a constitution was promulgated. It is important to note that the liturgy, the Eber Bible, and Eber Hymn Book were strong unifying factors for the church in both the English-speaking and the French-speaking parts of Eberland. The church, then known as Bremen Mission, Eber Christo Hammer and Nanywe Hammer, came under the supervision of the Scottish Mission at the instance of the state and was renamed Eber Presbyterian Church in 1926.
The church was known by several names as it went through history. It was initially known as Bremen Mission Church because it was founded by the Bremen missionaries. Then it became known as the Ever Hammer, as the church for Ever people. It also became known as Ever Presbyterian Hammer. After the German missionaries left, the Scottish missionaries came to take over administration. And the Scottish practiced the Presbyterian system of governance. So when they came, they discovered that lay leadership in the church had a lot of giftings which they could use. So they introduced the Presbyterian system into church administration. So by that, the church took the name of Presbyterian Hammer. In 1903, the Basel missionaries, who were the founders of the Presbyterian Church of Ghana, handed over a number of congregations in the Buemkrachi area to the EP Church. So in 1954, these churches resented being called Ewe people because they are not Ewes. So they opted out and started a new church called the Presbyterian Evangelical Church of Buemkrati. The Presbyterian Church of Ghana and the EP Church, or the Presbyterian Church, were not in favor. So they had a meeting, they formed a committee under the leadership of the two moderators of these two churches, Right Reverend Galavo for the EP Church and Right Reverend Ojija from the PCG, or the Presbyterian Church of Ghana. This committee recommended and advised that the Presbyterian Church adopt a new name using evangelical in place of the Ewe. So in 1954, a synod was held at Peje, and this synod decided that the church should adopt this new name. So that is why the church became Evangelical Presbyterian Church.
Meanwhile, the Germans returned to the Gold Coast after the First World War and worked with the African leaders until the Second World War broke out, when they had to leave again. It is said that Reverend Paul Vigrebe, the last missionary to leave during the Second World War, was arrested by British soldiers at this building, which used to be the missionary office at Akpafutoji, and while being escorted away, met the EP school children who were singing Ewe Hymn 358, which he later referred to in an account as prophetic. The Bremen Mission and other organizations continued to support the EP Church for years, and the church had grown by leaps and bounds.
The missionaries did not neglect what they started, even though they were not here in person. The records indicated that they were with the church in spirit. After the German missionaries left, the government of Ghana invited the Scottish Mission to take over the supervisory work of the orphan church in the Anglophone territory. So the Church of Scotland took over. Immediately the dust of the First World War settled, the Bremen missionaries returned to continue helping in their work. One of them was Reverend Beveridge, and others that followed were Herman Schuster and Paul Vigrebe.
Other forms of support were also provided in the areas of finance, human resource, and material. For instance, the United Church Board for World Missionaries in America sent a team led by Reverend Eugene Grau. It was Mrs. Grau who started the Women Bible class for the training of women in the church. By 1947, the church membership was over 46,000. The church had 325 schools, 2 hospitals, one at Rara and the other at Adidome, agricultural stations at Bimbila, Yendi, and Chiraponi. Under the leadership of Reverend Beveridge, the church started a teacher training college at Amejepe.
One other great achievement was the EP Church came into partnership with the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church of Ghana to establish a pastoral training school called the Trinity College, which is now Trinity Theological Seminary. This seminary was established in 1942, started in Kumasi and later moved to Accra, where it is now. The church started a number of schools. The Mauli School in Ho, the EP Secondary School at Hohoi, and technical and vocational schools at strategic places. These are some of the achievements of the church. By the time they celebrated its 100 years and thereafter.
The church also made way for the training of women in ministry. The first two were Reverend Bertha Ayele Dovlo and Reverend Felicia Anyagle Mensah Dade, popularly called Fam Dade, who later became the first national coordinator of the women's ministry for the EP Church of Ghana. It has been gathered that many members of the church at this time were attracted to somewhat more spiritual churches. Many schisms in the church which led to the founding of churches such as the Apostles' Revelation Society, the White Cross Society, the Lord's Pentecostal Church, and Christ Evangelical Mission are said to have taken off around this period.
Members of the church found it strange to be in the church and to be confronted with certain spiritual issues, and the church was not able to rescue them. So many members were in the church and also taking part in traditional spiritual matters outside the church. That was the gap which the Bible study and prayer fellowship came to fill.
At this point in the life of the church in Ghana, what was happening in the EP Church was widespread. It was lukewarmness in all the churches in Ghana. But God, doing his own good work, at this time there were revivals in the campuses, mostly brought in by scripture union teachings in the young men and the Christian teachers at the campuses, the university campuses. And organizations were formed to go for evangelistic missions in towns. Some of us who come from the Volta region, who were members of the Christian fellowships in the campuses, the University of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and some other campuses decided to form Volta Evangelistic Association and go to the Volta region and preach to our own people.
The founding fathers were Ralph Keteku, George Kum, Victor Otitiaku, Victor Bodo, Wilson Awaso, Yao Fiagbe, Chris Bonredi, Solomon Avotri, Mauli Goka, and Nelson Nyako.
We were mostly involved in evangelistic associations, spreading the word of God. from village to village, town to town in the Volta region. And we were also planting churches at that time because we saw the need to make more disciples for Christ.
We found out that the EP Church was a dominant Protestant church in the Volta region. So our activities concentrated mostly in the EP Church. And we started with the Volta, what we call VIA, in the churches in the Volta region.
At the same time, there was a wave of prayer and power demonstrations among other groupings in the country, including the Bible Study and Prayer Group.
And these two groups also started working together, VIA and the Bible Study and Prayer Group, because we were all members of the church, particularly the EP Church, and also members in the two groups. So we worked together as a team to revive the EP Church.
While VIA worked to revive spirituality in the life of members, the Bible Study and Prayer Group was also emerging through a revival that was started in Kumasi Amekom EP Church. The founding fathers of the Bible Study and Prayer Group were Messias GFK Akwayi, WK Do Bojikoklo, LK Blame, CY Adinkra, and Madame Constancia Ahovi. It is on record that the acceptance of the group helped in halting the drift of members to spiritual churches. According to Dr. Victor Kudu, the Bible Study and Prayer Group was a formidable group with well-demarcated structures. Its aim was to help the EP Church harness the giftings in members and grow the Church of the Lord. However, the outcome of what came to be a struggle for what was right in the sight of the Lord shows that God looked ahead and would not allow the work of the pioneers to be wiped off.
Well, the activities of the group mainly concentrated on the study of the Bible and the practice of what it says, especially prayer, fasting, and so on. But when our colleagues from the universities joined in, they intensified the lifting the knowledge level of the people. Every January we had a leadership training, so we trained people, and when we are training the people, we normally open the door. All the groups within the church, not only the prayer group, CYB, and we allow them to bring their leaders so that we train them.
The church before this period had been led by the following moderators and synod clerks: Very Reverends Andreas Aku, David Bensa, E. Awuma, B.S. Amegashi, M.W. Akama, E.K. Galavo, A.K. Abutiate, and C.K. Dovlo. For synod clerks, Reverend P.S. Kwame, Reverend C.G. Baita, Professor Emeritus, Reverend G.K. Ampofo, Reverend F.R. Ametowobla, Reverend F.H. Buachi, Reverend E.Y. Forsing, and Reverend A.Y. Wurapa. The 1931 Constitution for the EP Church in Ghana and Togo was revised and was to be adopted by the 13th Joint Synod of 1975 held in Ho from August 23 to 27, to be tried for 3 years. It was to be adopted in 1978. However, due to border closures between Ghana and Togo at the time, the Joint Synod to give approval for the printing of the document could not come off. It was finally published in 1979 and had since been the only valid constitution within the church till the election of Reverend Professor Jobo in 1980. Who was Reverend Professor Noah Komla Jobo, and how did he become the head of the church?
The EP Church entered into partnership with United Church of Christ, Board of World Ministries. They decided to train 2 pastors for the church. So they recommended him and also Reverend Agbola to go to the States to attend seminary. So they came back in the early 60s and they were ordained as Reverend ministers. So he had the chance of going back to University of Edinburgh for his PhD degree. When he came back, he started teaching at Cape Coast University. Apart from lecturing, he was given an oversight duty for our church in Cape Coast, Sekandi, Takoradi areas. The young pastors met and they came up with the idea that we should nominate Professor Jobo.
Reverend Professor N.K. Jobo was inducted into office in January 1981, and he took over as the 9th indigenous moderator of the EP Church.
Some of us were very happy because we felt he is an intellectual, somebody who is a professor teaching in the university and is a Christian. That was our belief. So we were full of hope that he will bring some dimension of progress in the church.
He was full of physical development projects, emphasizing community development and education. His administration instituted a number of social interventions that were highly appreciated by members and pastors in general.
He engaged in a lot of social intervention, support people, especially those in the deprived area. There was hunger around those days, and he was able to raise resources to support those people. He also promoted music, especially our traditional Voltairean music. He even formed a group known as Dumadafo, or who is the ambassador choir of the church. And they promoted a lot of traditional music, like Ziggy, Adawu, Bobobo, Agbaja, and all those things. That resonates with us at the time.
Being an educationist, he was able to ground the church by helping establish some schools. We have the Malco Girls Secondary School as an example. I was then in Mali when he started it, and it's a positive thing that he has done. So we appreciate, and we have other schools for the church in the north. Recently I went to Saboba and I saw one of the EP secondary schools there over there. So there are things that he did to help the church.
He helped train pastors to acquire higher education.
Reverend Dr. Francis Fred Kobla Abuchi was the youth director of the EP Church and worked closely with Right Reverend Professor Jobo at the church's head office in Ho.
He took office and with lofty ideas about transforming the church. He was very critical about a lot of things. To him, the way they were leading the church was somehow mediocre. So he is the right guy to put things in order.
The Evangelical Presbyterian Church holds the Apostles' Creed as its basis of faith. Meanwhile, the teachings of the moderator were based on a doctrine he was introducing to the church through the pastors gradually. This was generally referred to as the Melagbe theology.
In 1984, the 4 partner churches in Germany and Église Presbyterienne Evangelique du Togo and EP Church Ghana, they wanted to go into a theological dialogue. So they invited him to be the main speaker, and that's where he launched his Malagbe theology. He calls it affirmative African Christian theology. And according to him, as Evans, we affirm life that can be seen in our names, like Agbeko, Agbepavi, Agbanyefia, Agbanyaga, the rest. That means we are life affirming. And that is why when we wake up, you meet somebody, you ask the one, Alagbea. That means, are you alive? So we are life affirming. So that was the basis of this anti-Christ theology he propounded.
According to Reverend Professor Jobo, God meant Se, and people called Seshi were married to God and should not be troubled to get converted.
So he was also saying that one day he went to a conference in Cotonou, and in one of the villages they toured, he saw a lot of buildings with snake drawn on them, with the scale underneath. So they told him they are Dankpo, the snake shrines. And so they told him that every year the snake sheds of its scale. And so he took the idea and propounded that the snake says Mafonhe. That means when it sheds off its scale, it means rejuvenation. So we as Africans, we rejuvenate all the time through our practices, customs, traditions, and the rest. So he drew 2 emblems, one a cross intertwined with Jenyami symbol. That is Malagbe symbol. And the second symbol, a cross with a snake on it, with its tail going back to its mouth. And underneath is written Mafonhe. So these are the 2 symbols of Malagbe theology. And he presented this as an academic or a critical thinking, something by a professor. I'll put it that way.
The Melagbe theology and other actions of Reverend Professor Jobo were offensive to many members of the church and affiliates of the Volta Evangelistic Association and the Bible Study and Prayer Group. It is said that in spite of the differences of opinion pertaining to the moderator's doctrines, some level of cordiality existed between Right Reverend Professor Jobo and the leadership of the Bible Study and Prayer Group. This is why, upon the moderator's return to Ghana from a meeting of the World Council of Churches, where a call was made to member churches to give attention to the Apostles' Creed, the moderator mandated the Bible Study and Prayer Group to prepare study outlines on the Creed to be used in the church. The executive complied and did it faithfully. So, what went wrong?
If you have an agenda and you don't believe he is promoting your cause, it will come to a point where it will show up. We were cordial. We thought we were part of the church. So anything we could do, if we create a platform like our conventions, it was a major sale. So we go and the senior clerk will collect their literature for us. We'll come and sell it, send the money to them. Because the amount of money we get on that convention alone, sometimes the whole year they haven't sold things to that level. And it went on for quite some time. People suddenly, as we said from the beginning, that the church has become cold. Now suddenly find that the church isn't as cold as they have been liberated. The people from the fellowship, when they get encounters in their own homes, they are able on their own stand firm, pray to the Lord for things to happen, which they have never experienced. So naturally, it is the work of the Lord, and it is the Lord doing his own thing. We wouldn't have felt any jealousy, because I don't believe that any of the officers or the fellowship at the time was trying to usurp the authority of the church. We were just doing our work.
It is noted in various accounts that around the same time, the church administration was growing averse to the practices of the prayer group, criticizing the group for its closeness to the Pentecostal movement. Among other things, Professor Jobo renamed the Bible Study and Prayer Group as Bible Study and Prayer Fellowship, saying the group was no longer meant for certain individuals but the total membership of the congregations. According to some pastors, Reverend Professor Jobo feared that Dr. Nathan Soji was gaining too much popularity among the members of the church, as some saw him as the moderator of the church. In 1983, the moderator caused the reprinting of the church's constitution, which was printed earlier in 1979. The Bible Study and Prayer Fellowship, as part of its usual practices, decided to study the reprinted constitution thoroughly and noticed amendments in Articles 29, 30, and 37 of the 1979 Constitution. The amendment was to allow the moderator and the synod clerk to remain in office as long as they were capable. Some inactions on the part of the moderator caused divisions at various levels of church life.
There were divisions in the pastors' front, but to be frank, most of the pastors were not for him, but they remained quiet, they could not speak. But some few people were for him, they were very vocal. Those of us who were also against him were vocal. I could remember there was a time we went to pastor association meeting. If you were not for him, they would not even allow you to speak at the pastor association meeting. Reverend Dumebi raised his hand to speak at the meeting. And Reverend Asamoah, the interchurch, shut him down. He said, "Sit down there." And Reverend Dumebi sat down. Then I stood up. I said, "Reverend Dumebi, stand up and speak." I stood there. I said, if did not speak, the meeting will not go on. I was standing. Everybody was looking at me. They couldn't believe that I could do that. Very young in the ministry. So Reverend Dumebi stood up and talked his mind before I sat down. Whenever some of us young people who were bold, when we talk at the meeting and we had break, the elderly people will come and shake you and say, "Hey, we are behind you. Go ahead. We are behind you." We are behind, but they cannot talk. They rather who were older people. We are behind you. So we know we had people behind us.
Then, in 1988, news spread that the moderator had declared his intention to stand for a third term as moderator. This drove some individuals and groups to protest against his intention.
There came to a point where there was a rumor going around that Jobo is going for the third term. When the Constitution tells us he must go there for 2 terms and another moderator will come. I was a leader in the Bible Study and Prayer Fellowship in Mamprobi, and we discussed this rumor. That was said, no, we must stop him from doing that. So we decided to meet, pray, and talk about that message, that Jobo was going for a third term. That was where we started meeting at Combs' office. From Combs' office, then we came to the Junior Judge Combs' office to meet and discuss the rumor that Jobo is going for a third term, when the Constitution does not say that. And more so, it said that as far as he's alive, he remains a moderator.
Sometime in June 1988, Mr. James Agbeblo, who was the president for Volta Evangelical Association, called me. So when I went there, he then said there was a group in our church in Kumasi, the EP Church, were trying to organize a demonstration. So they asked Accra people and members of the church in Accra to participate in. So he also told me late Albert Fiajipi will be coming to his office that afternoon, so we could wait for him. So when he came, he knew about the issues already. So as a result of the discussion, we then said, and I suggested that, okay, because Ghana Presby was having problem at the time with leadership, and then at the very time to Methodist Church were in court because their president, Reverend Stephen, was also in court because he said that he had not served the number of years he was supposed to serve before they were trying to push him. So he was in court. So when I started, then I said that because of these problems in the Christendom, it was not advisable for us to go on that line. And it would be like washing your dirty linen in the public for everybody to see. Then I said, oh, couldn't we resolve it? And then they mentioned a number of attempts they made to resolve, but it wasn't successful. But then we decided that maybe we should try another chance. If it's possible, we might listen. So with Fiajibe then said that EP Church has a Accra office in Kuku Hill. So we drove to Kuku Hill, and then the keeper there put us through to moderator because he wanted to book appointment to meet him in his office at home. He said that he was prepared to meet us, but he had a scheduled meeting in Accra. So if we could rather meet him in Accra, and then he gave us the venue and the date he'll be in Accra. So we agreed, and then we organized ourselves and met him. We discussed 3 things with him, mainly the constitutional issue, that there were some changes in the constitution which everybody says that they were not aware of. His predecessor, a very Reverend C.K. Dovlo, said that he did not make that change before he left office in 1980.
The period of tension dragged on as the crisis deepened with the advent of the Revolutionary Guard, which became known as Concerned Members in 1988. Reverend Professor Fuga explains how he became a concerned member and the steps they took to resolve their concerns.
In 1987, there was some disagreement over some clauses which were introduced in the Constitution illegally And so that matter was simmering and people were talking about it. I think attempts were made during those days. In 1984 by the pastors, in 1985 by some of the presbyteries, West Volta Presbytery, which had its headquarters in Accra, the Southern Presbytery. Attempts were made to have those discrepancies resolved in the Constitution. But it looks like at that time, it was not possible to do it because the moderator at that time was powerful and nobody could have his way. And so the matter was becoming heated. And because the church itself was so politicized, some people decided in Accra that the matter must be taken. Somebody must, go to Jobo and find out exactly what was happening and to get him to explain these constitutional discrepancies and problems. The Accra people decided to send a message to Kumasi so that somebody could come from Kumasi to represent Kumasi and the brethren here to go and talk to Jobo and find out from him some of these problems and grievances.
Dr. Victor Kodo, the president of the group, conferred with Mr. Edem Tete, now Very Reverend Dr. Edem Tete, who invited Professor Frank Fuga to represent the Kumasi area.
It was an urgent call. You didn't have to think a lot. You just have to decide and say, yes, I will go. I must add also that Mr. Ayira from Kumasi joined me later. 14 of us met Professor Jobo at that time. And we discussed a number of issues. We talked about the Constitution, we talked about the financial issues of the church, we talked about tribalism, we talked about lack of transparency, a number of things. That the most important reason we met him was about the Constitution. James Agbeble was our spokesperson. The lawyer who was representing us at that time was lawyer Fiajigbe. He was the lawyer.
Following the demonstration, a pastoral letter was circulated among all congregations of the church on the excommunication of Dr. N.D. Soji. The church leadership planned to suspend the constitution of the Bible Study and Prayer Fellowship and to dissolve its national executive, among other things. However, that year, the fellowship defied all directives from the church administration and went ahead to celebrate its 10th anniversary, which was attended by members numbering more than 10,000 at Angoga in the Volta region. Meanwhile, a faction was emerging in support of the Jobo camp. They were called Defenders of the Faith, made up of the clergy and the laity. Their main aim was to ensure that Reverend Professor Jobo remained in office to complete the third term as moderator.
Well, the Defenders of the Faith were pro-Jobo people who wanted to support him or were supporting him no matter what. So they were determined to disrupt, to cause confusion in whatever the concerned members were doing. So they targeted individuals, targeted groups to cause trouble. They wrote letters to the police, wrote letters to Anijage committee and so on, just to support the cause of Jobo. They stood very firmly behind Jobo.
The concerned members decided to take legal action against Reverend Professor Jobo and his colleagues since they would not heed their call to have the matter resolved amicably.
It was not our aim to go to court. The demonstration took place before the synod, which was going to induct Reverend Jobo or formally accept Reverend Jobo as a moderator for the EP Church for the third time. So we were hoping that when the demonstration came on, somebody would come and say, let's talk, and perhaps conclude that his election was not legal. So let's redo it again if that was going to be possible. Nothing like that happened. All that we saw or heard was that the synod was going to come on, even after the demonstration, to formally accept him as the moderator for the third time for the EP Church. And we didn't have any other recourse, so we decided to go to court.
The case was first lodged at the High Court in Accra by 6 of the concerned members: Mr. James Agbeblewo, Mr. Hope Yomekbe, Togbe Christopher Gebumensa, Mr. Frank Fuga, Mr. Wade Mfianyo Kwame Adraku, and Mr. Benjamin Komla Deborah. Their request was for the court to declare, among other things, the nomination and election of Reverend Professor Jobo as null and void.
A writ was issued by our lawyer, Mr. Defafa Kuni. He issued the writ, and it was we filed it on the 14th of July, 1988. So that was what happened. So, and in it, we asked for a number of things. Basically, a perpetual injunction against him not to take office, or not the synod not to endorse him.
Justice A.W. Dove, presiding over the High Court, granted the interim injunction pending the final hearing and determination of the substantive case.
The justice saw the case and imposed an injunction quickly on the synod. Okay. But then, of course, they did not have the opportunity to respond. We call that ex parte, So they came back from Ho to come and argue the case, that they had a genuine case. They can prove that the Constitution was properly amended and that they win if they go to court. So the injunction should be discharged. More so, they had already printed invitation letters. People are on their way from overseas for the synod. If the injunction was placed, it would be such an embarrassment to the whole church. So they pleaded with the court to discharge the injunction so the synod could come on. After all, after the synod, we had the whole period debate whether his election was valid or not. And the court agreed.
The defendants filed an application to have the interim order set aside, and this was granted on the 20th of July 1988 by the same court, presided over by Justice S.A. Brobe. The defendants argued that the 1979 Constitution, which limited the moderator's service tenure to 2 terms only, had been amended, and that the action was brought to embarrass the church, which had invited external partners to witness the 1988 synod. The church went ahead to endorse Reverend Professor Jobo's nomination for the 3rd term of service. After the endorsement by synod, the plaintiffs returned to the Accra High Court for the determination of the substantive suit. At this point, the synod committee appointed 6 high-ranking personalities of the church, chosen by the Pastors Association, to settle the matter out of court, but this attempt was not fruitful. The case was reverted to the Accra High Court, but was transferred to the Ho High Court at the instance of the defendants to save them time traveling long hours to Accra. The case continued at Ho High Court, and judgment was delivered on the 18th of December 1989.
The judge there was Justice Isaac Amwa. He was the judge who handled the case. Okay, on the 18th of December 1989, then he gave judgments for us. All the reliefs that we were asking for, then he granted them, and then he added the 50,000 cedis as cost. The defendants were EP Church as a first defendant, and then the Reverend Professor Jobo was the second defendant.
The defendants, dissatisfied with the judgment, lodged an appeal in the Court of Appeal in Accra. On 22nd December 1989, he applied to the High Court in Ho to stay the execution of the judgment of 18th December, pending the hearing and determination of the appeal. Justice G.K. Akwa denied the application, saying Professor Jobo's continued stay in the office would inflame the already explosive situation in the church. He awarded 10,000 cedis cost for the plaintiffs.
The judgment was said that he was restrained from acting as the moderator of the church. So he applied for stay of execution. Vacation judge then was Justice George Akwa. The first move, he did not grant the stay of execution. The defendant again then went to the Court of Appeal and repeated the application before the Court of Appeal. They granted the stay for him.
Reverend Jobo repeated the application to stay the execution of judgment at the Court of Appeal in Accra. In a 2-1 split decision, the Court of Appeal granted the application. Soon after that, Reverend Jobo and his administration resumed their acts of intimidation.
So in between, Jobo then started issuing threats. Pastors were receiving letters, and then there was a threat on the clergy and the leadership of the Bible study and prayer group. So because of that, we had to go back to court again, that we issued a new writ at the whole High Court to restrain him from sacking or banning the Bible study and prayer group, and then also transferring pastors and then sacking, dismissing any pastor who was seen to be supporting the concerned member.
The following pastors were excommunicated: Reverend C.F.A. Bedi, Reverend Victor Emmanuel Optitiako, Reverend Emmanuel K. Bodre, Reverend William K. Senya, Reverend W.K. Amedeka, Reverend Gift K. Agama, Reverend G.F.K. Akwayi, and Reverend Francis F.K. Abuchi. The rest were Reverend G.N.K. Agbefem, Reverend Edward K. Amenyadu, Reverend Samuel K. Misroda, Reverend Samuel D. K. Dumavi, Reverend E. K. Boahene, Reverend Setowu K. Ofore, Reverend E. A. Atiase, Reverend M. V. Dogbe, Reverend G. K. Agama, Reverend W. K. Senya, and Reverend F. A. M. Dade. 13 lay members were also excommunicated. They were Dr. Moses Adibo, Mrs. Comfort Gane, Mr. Dan Amlalo, Mrs. Bernice Abba, Mr. Vincent Chikuno, Dr. N.D. Soji, and Dr. O.K. Atobra. The rest were Mrs. Christine Doe, Dr. C.S.K. Boje, Mr. Edem Kokutete, Dr. Victor K. Bodo, Mr. Remel Adusraku, and Mr. W.K. Bojikoklu. The second defendant, Reverend Professor Jobo, filed a motion that the 1979 Constitution had not been promulgated by the EP Church and that the only valid Constitution was the 1931 Constitution. The case was determined on the 23rd of May 1991. The Accra faction was the first to call a press conference to announce its next steps. Mr. Dan Amlalo was the declarant. He shares what happened that day.
The press conference was to explain the judgment to the members of the Bible Study and Prayer Fellowship who were gathered at the time that yes, the ruling has been given. The judges have said this, but looking at things, these are the implications and this is what we want to do. So it was discussed and members accepted and said, yes, that's the right thing to do. Let's just declare ourselves as an autonomous church and hold ourselves, go by the word of God, meet, pray, and do everything. And we had pastors on our side. Some of them were excommunicated.
The group decided to quickly mobilize their members to keep them under another administration which they had decided to create. This decision was taken at the first press conference held at Southla on the 23rd of May 1991.
Another administration to hold this group together. Because you know, at the Southla Declaration, we said the members should hold themselves as autonomous individual churches until further notice. So that's 2 weeks. The 8th June, then the Nungua Declaration, and us in that we're taking ourselves to become EP Church of Ghana, just in fulfillment of the declaration by the court that the church did not have a constitution, because the 79 constitution was the only valid constitution and there was no change. Therefore, if there was no change, then we did not have a moderator.
The retort from the church leadership at Ho was that Mr. Dan Amlalo, then the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, had no constitutional right to declare congregations as autonomous. 2 weeks later, the Accra faction called another press conference with Dr. Moses Adibo, then the Director of Medical Services under the Ministry of Health, as the declarant. He says he did not know he was making history at the time by declaring the start of a budding branch of the missionary work.
I wasn't privy to the first declaration that was made, but the reaction of the EP Church was that the person who addressed the press conference was a non-entity and a few disgruntled members, which angered me. Because Dan Amlalo, even though he was young, he had risen to become the head of the EPA. And I very much respected him. And his interest in the church also impressed me.
For Dr. Moses Adibo, the concerned members thought he was not interested in the politics of the church, being a civil servant. But with the developments, he approached the group himself.
So one day, I approached Mr. Yomekwe and asked him how the concerned members financed the affairs. He told me it was on individual basis. So I took note, and the next time I met him, I gave him some amount. And that's how he made sure that he briefed me after every event.
Lawyer Richard there explains how what happened in the EP Church was not a schism, but a split.
My understanding of the schism is that it's a breakaway or splinter group. Okay. But in this particular case, that was not what happened. What occurred was that in our reckoning, about 50% of the church members decided one way or the other. We realized that most of the congregations in Accra and Kumasi, most of them, at least the most active ones, okay, supported the cause of the concerned members. And then also in the Volta region, mainly on the southern part of it, a number of congregations have declared their autonomy for the concerned members. They wanted to be autonomous. That was our first call, was to ask all the congregations that believed that 1979 was the rightful constitution of the church. And then those who did not support the action of Reverend Pastor Jobo, they should declare autonomy. So we had a number of them. Mainly for the southern, almost all of them supported the EP Church of Ghana. In Greater Accra, a number of congregations also supported. And in Greater Accra, every congregation was affected. Every congregation. We did not move out, there was no split. There was in the Greater Accra. In Kumasi, number of them congregation also decided to support the cause of the concerned members.
It is important at this point to mention that Reverend Professor Jobo, in his parting speech delivered to the EP Church at the Trade Fair site in 1997, stated these words, "Mama Magbalam Dinami," meaning, "It is division I leave behind." The two churches began their engagement in reconciliation talks just after the split, at the instance of various bodies and some individuals.
As a matter of fact, when the split happened in 1991, the first group of people that made effort to reconcile the two factions, the Accra and the Whole faction, were the Volta Region House of Chiefs. They took that step because they felt the church had a large following in the Volta region. So dividing at that time, they felt going to affect the region where that was allowed. So they made effort to quell the whole issue that started. However, that didn't seem to work. There were occasions, I remember, when they called meetings to talk together about the position at the time, but it was turned down by the late Reverend Professor Jobo. It was turned down. And so the chiefs were frustrated, so they stopped. Their efforts came in from the international as well as the national bodies.
The moderator of the Global Evangelical Church, Right Reverend Prosper Samuel Jomeku, relates some specific progress made towards uniting the churches.
Somewhere during the tenure of Very Reverend Dr. E.K. Bodwe, Dr. Bodwe invited me to join a committee that was actually meeting over this whole issue of reconciliation. But even before then, I know that there were a number of efforts that people made, particularly Christian Council, Women Mission, and some individuals made a lot of attempts to bring the two churches together. But much of those meetings couldn't yield the expected result. The earlier bitterness that was expressed between the two churches, you realize that we're no longer in that era. We are now sitting down together as brothers and sisters. And we all thought that such a moment should have happened earlier. But I want to put on record that greater part of our meetings and most of the things we did were facilitated by Reverend Dr. Setrinyomi, who was then the General Secretary working with the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. And he actually provided most of our logistics. And it was his dream, whatever he could do, to push us to continue the reconciliation talk.
The talks took them to the southern part of the Volta region, where the dream almost materialized. But for the legal action some members of the EP Church Ghana took against the leadership of their church a couple of years later, which have halted the exploratory efforts. The split did not end the court cases. The whole administration went to court to restrain the EP Church of Ghana from using the name. In its judgment, the High Court sitting in Accra ruled in 2002 that the name of EP Church of Ghana should be changed to avoid confusion in the minds of the public. This forced the church to select a new name.
The Synod Committee asked every presbytery to bring a name. When 3 presbyteries already brought the same name without referring to each other, you see that God is working. And so when the vote came, that name, Global Evangelical Church, stood that day. That is how we became Global Evangelical Church.
The split further ignited more court cases over church properties, especially as the 2 churches were no longer using the same name.
We had a lot of court cases which were instituted by EP Church Ghana. That's the whole administration. We had a Safla case. We had the Fiave, EP Church of Ghana.
Other congregations affected were Jelukope, Keta, Amakum, Atonsu, and Teshi. The establishment of the head office of the Global Evangelical Church was possible through the team effort of selfless members.
The spirit of volunteerism was great, very high. That is why all the people we knew, like Reverend Dr. Tete, who became a moderator, Reverend Prince Tepe, who became a senior clerk, Reverend Ati, who became a senior clerk, and Reverend Professor Fuga, they didn't turn our invitation which we sent to them to be pastors, they didn't turn it down. They all wanted to come and help. And so it was like volunteering to help. And you see the Bible study and prayer group members were very resourceful. In all the villages were sending people there to preach. Because one of the questions that people kept on asking us is that, can we have pastors in the villages? Can we have pastors?
That same year, the EP Church of Ghana, now Global Evangelical Church, began efforts to train its own pastors. These efforts led to the establishment of the Global Theological Seminary, which has so far trained pastors and lay leaders numbering more than 2,000. The Global Evangelical Church has in its efforts to build a united church put in place measures to correct the anomalies that led to the split in the EP Church Ghana. One of these steps was to define an identity which sets out the church's basis of faith, among other things.
After the split, there was the need for us to have an identity. so that we know what we are standing for. And also because of the many churches around. If we talk about the Global Evangelical Church, people should know, the members in the first place should know what we stand for, why we do what we do, our belief system, our core values, our heroes, our symbols, what they stand for. All these are embedded in the corporate identity.
Other social interventions the church is executing include the donation of wheelchairs to individuals and health institutions. The Gesam Educational Support Fund, GESU Fund, has also given out scholarships to needy but brilliant students.
Those who started it were our youth. They looked at what happened on campus, how some of their fellow students, girls, became victim to men, maybe sometimes because of just some few CDs. And so they said, we need a scholarship. So they took the initiative, the church saw into it and endorsed it. We are praying that the fund will grow so that for a year we can give scholarships to hundreds of people. And we give scholarships not only to the Global Evangelical Church members. Once in a while, we give to others who don't belong to the Global Evangelical Church. We have Global Evangelical Church, our foreign mission. We have about 35 congregations in Togo, and we have created a whole presbytery there. So we look at them as part of the church, and we pay them from here. Let me be explicit on that. Yes. We also have branches in the US, UK, Norway, in Africa, in Tanzania, and La Côte d'Ivoire. We have branches all over there.
The Global Evangelical Church continues to carry out development efforts through the benevolence of its committed membership. The church also introduced the Congregational Infrastructural Development Program, CIDEP, which has enabled many congregations to pursue various projects. Over the past 30 years, the Global Evangelical Church has seen steady progress under the leadership of the following moderators, synod clerks, and programs and interchurch relations secretaries. Very Reverend Edward Kojo Amenyedu, Commander Retired Ferdinand Hope Bewonyo, Reverend Dr. Emmanuel Komlak Bodwe, Reverend Dr. Edem Kokutete, Very Reverend Dr. Setowu Kojo Ofori. For synod clerks, Reverend Victor Emmanuel Otitiaku, Reverend Setowu Kojo Ofori, Reverend Prince Yawotepe, and Reverend Raphael Mark Kwesi Ati. For programs and interchurch relations secretaries, Reverend Commodore Philemon Frank Kwe, Reverend Francis Fred Kobla Abuchi, and Reverend Samuel Dixon Kofi Dumavi. Lay presbyters who have served on the Synod Committee Executive so far are Mrs. Comfort Gane, Mr. N.K. Obiri, Dr. Victor Kodu, and Mrs. Mabel Hehemeku. Others are Mrs. Samuel Aboga, Mrs. Charity Agbeblewu, Mrs. Enyonam Keteku, and Dr. Edward Agozi. The rest are Professor Mrs. Victoria Pearl Jugbefia, Professor Raymil Kwame Adosraku, and Mrs. Christine Bobobi. Mr. Francis Akoto, Mr. Kojo Mata, and Mr. S.E.S. Kuleke served as treasurers before the position was scrapped alongside that of the Programs and Interchurch Relations Secretary in 2011. In January 2022, the Global Evangelical Church inducted into office Right Reverend Prosper Samuel Jomeku, moderator, Reverend Dr. Johannes Ahiabu, the Synod Clerk, Mr. Ayram Achu, the male presbyter, and Mrs. Joyce Diodone Ahiabo, the female presbyter, on the Synod Committee Executive.
The Lord Jesus Christ has come to reconcile us to God, and He has given us the ministry of reconciliation as observed by Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18 to 20, that having reconciled us, He has committed to us the ministry of reconciliation.
Thus the saying of Christ remains true: I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Matthew 16:18.